Welcome back to the deep dive. Are you trying to, get up to speed on important topics quickly, really understand the core ideas?
Because that's what we aim for here, cut through the noise.
Exactly. And today we're diving into something pretty significant in workplace safety,
Mm.
how the big international standard, ISO 4501 from 2018, handles what's called systems thinking. It manages occupational health and safety, OHSMS for short.
Yeah, ISO 4501.201, it's the global standard now for OHS management. And it's worth remembering it wasn't an easy birth, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
Now, it took quite a few attempts to get everyone on board internationally. It finally landed in 2018. And the idea was really to shift things, put OHS right at the strategic center of a company, you know, make risk management more proactive.
Okay, and that links directly to our focus today, right? This idea of systems thinking.
Absolutely.
We're looking at a specific study that examined how well ISO 4501 actually incorporates this way of thinking. Maybe explain systems thinking a bit more.
Sure. It's basically about seeing the bigger picture. Instead of just looking at, say, one faulty machine or one procedure in isolation, you look at how everything connects the people, the tech, the processes, the environment, how they all influence each other.
Right, like seeing the whole forest, not just individual trees, especially important in complex areas like OHS.
Exactly. And this study we're digging into, well, it measured the standard against 8 specific tenets or principles of systems thinking, which the researchers pulled together from academic work.
Gotcha. So the mission for us today.
Well, it's to figure out if an organization implements ISO 4501, does it actually help them move beyond just those isolated safety bits and pieces?
Does it encourage them to see their whole operation as what the study calls a socio-technical system, considering all those connections?
Precisely. Does it foster that integrated view? That's the question.
Okay, let's set the stage a bit. OHS management systems, they haven't just appeared out of nowhere, have they?
Not at all. This whole area, the development of systems, the laws around them, the standards, it really started picking up steam, more than 20 years ago now.
And you mentioned getting international agreement wasn't easy. Was there pushback?
There was some initial reluctance. Yeah. Interesting point. Back in '96, there was a workshop and survey in the U.S. It actually found larger companies were maybe more hesitant about a global standard than smaller ones were.
Huh.
Any idea why?
The study didn't delve deep into the why, but it suggests scale played a role in initial perspectives. Maybe more complex structures felt a global standard would be harder to implement, just speculation though.
And before 45,001 unified things, it sounds like it was a bit messy.
Oh, definitely. You had all sorts of different national standards, regional guidelines. If you were a company working across borders, it could get really confusing trying to figure out what applied where.
Yeah, I can see that. So a unified standard like 4501 makes sense. But what about actually getting certified? Do people agree it helps? Well, that's where you get different views. Some absolutely believe certification drives real improvement in safety performance. Others are more skeptical.
Skeptical how?
They might see it as, more paperwork, more bureaucracy, maybe costly, and perhaps not even that effective in the real world, especially with things like outsourcing complicating the picture.
And does the research back one side or the other? Is there clear evidence these systems work?
It's honestly a bit of a mixed bag. You do find studies showing positive links like employees feeling happier, reporting more incidents, which is actually a good sign.
Right. Means they feel safer speaking up.
Exactly. And some studies show fewer accidents. So positives, yes.
But
Yeah.
there's always a but, isn't there?
Well, yeah. Other research flags some potential limitations, like these systems might not be great at handling new emerging risks, the stuff that wasn't anticipated.
Things that fall outside the established procedures.
Kind of. And there's this concern that sometimes the focus shifts too much towards just ticking the boxes for the audit, compliance over genuine safety improvement on the ground.
The study gives an example, right? The Norwegian fish farms.
That's a good illustration, yes. They implemented more OHS measures because of the standardized management approach. But the workers doing the jobs didn't always feel those measures were actually practical or relevant for their daily work.
So a disconnect between the system on paper and the reality.
Potentially, yes. And another review even suggested that chasing certification could, in some cases, actually get in the way of organizational learning.
How so?
Maybe by making companies focus too much on the risks that are easy to audit while potentially overlooking more complex stuff, like psychosocial risks that are harder to measure but still really important.
So it really hammers home that just having the system isn't enough.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Its success really depends on the organization's internal context, the culture, how people are managed, leadership's priorities.
Balancing productivity and safety, always a challenge.
Always. And the external context matters too. But we also know what does tend to work.
Okay, like what?
Things like real, open dialogue between managers and workers, a genuine, shared desire to improve, good monitoring systems, and importantly, learning from when things go right and when they go wrong.
A strong safety culture, training.
Yep, those investments pay off. So if you boil it down, the research points to some core necessary elements for successful OHSMSs.
Let's hear them. What are the must-haves?
Okay, top of the list. Visible commitment from leadership. Can't fake that. Then, real worker participation, not just telling them, but involving them.
Makes sense.
Effective knowledge sharing, enough resources, people, time, money, proper risk assessments that go beyond the obvious, clear responsibilities, and good communication, up, down, and sideways.
And what about the role of, like, government regulators?
That's evolving too.
Ah.
There seems to be a push to encourage improvements not just in one company, but across whole supply chains, and maybe moving from just punishing bad behavior to a mix of risk management focus and rule compliance.
Interesting. The outline also mentions something called total safety management, TSM.
Right, TSM. It's a framework that's explicitly based on systems thinking. It aims to help companies set safety goals and do risk assessments with that kind of shared, holistic understanding of how everything interacts.
So tying it back to ISO 4501 then, how should we think about its role? Is it the solution or?
The thinking is these standards are better viewed as flexible frameworks, guides, not rigid rule books. And maybe the reason it's sometimes hard to tell if they're working is because organizations aren't fully embracing that systems thinking perspective when they use them.
Which brings us right back to the study we're focusing on today. They specifically looked at ISO 4501 through that systems thinking lens. How did they go about it? What was their method?
Okay, so they used a qualitative approach. The team was made up of 5 OHS experts, a mix of academics and industry professionals.
Good to have that diverse expertise, I imagine.
Definitely, especially for something like systems thinking, which can be viewed differently. Their method had basically 2 main stages. First, they built an analytical framework, essentially. Their list of key systems thinking aspects based on existing research. Second, they used that framework to systematically assess the ISO 45001 standard document itself.
Let's unpack that framework development first. Where did they start?
They built on previous work, notably by researchers named Shorrock and Grant and their colleagues. These guys had already done significant work applying systems thinking ideas to safety, especially in complex socio-technical settings.
Like workplaces where tech and people interact a lot.
Exactly. Grant's team, for instance, had created a list of system safety tenets by looking at major theories about accident causation. So a solid starting point.
But they didn't stop there.
No, they want to make sure it was current. So they did a focused literature search in the database called Scopus.
Okay.
They looked for peer-reviewed articles in English, published between 2012 and 2021, that specifically had systems thinking and safety in the title. That netted them 14 key articles.
And what did they do with those 14 articles?
They went through them carefully, identifying the core concepts, the recurring ideas about systems thinking being discussed in relation to safety. They pulled out these key terms and phrases.
And from all that reading the foundational work, those 14 articles, they synthesized their own list.
Precisely. They distilled it down to 8 specific socio-technical system thinking tenets. They've got them listed nicely in a table in the paper.
And they double-checked this list.
Oh, yeah. The whole research team reviewed and refined it over 3 rounds to ensure it was solid and really reflected the literature. And importantly, each tenet considers both the internal stuff within the organization and the external context because, no system exists in a vacuum.
Right. Every organization is part of a bigger picture. Okay, so they have their 8 tenets. How did they apply them to the ISO standard?
They use something called a Delphi technique. It's a structured method for getting expert consensus.
How does that work?
Well, the lead author coordinated it. The other 4 researchers independently went through the standard, specifically the Australian-New Zealand version, ASNZS ISO 45001, which is basically the same as the international one.
Okay, independently reviewed it. Then what?
In round 1, each researcher identified sections or subsections where they thought each of the 8 tenets was either clearly visible or at least implied.
And how did they decide if there was agreement?
If at least 2 out of the 4 pointed to the same section for the same tenet, that was marked as tentative match. Anything where fewer than 2 agreed was flagged.
Okay, so they flagged the disagreements for round 2.
Exactly. In round two, they looked again specifically at those flagged areas. This time, they needed at least 3 out of the 4 researchers to agree on the link between the section and the tenet for it to be confirmed.
More stringent the second time around.
Right. And then the coordinator did a final check to make sure those agreed upon links aligned with their own assessment, too. It's a way to build confidence in the results, making sure it's not just one person's opinion.
Makes sense. Okay, so after that rigorous process, what did they find? How well did ISO 45701 stack up against these 8 systems thinking tenets?
The headline finding is pretty positive for the internal organizational context.
Meaning?
Meaning, when they looked at how the standard addresses things happening inside a company, they found evidence for all 8 systems thinking tenets being either visible or implied in different parts of ISO 40001.
So it does seem to encourage looking at internal safety issues from a systems viewpoint?
The potential is there, yes, based on the standards test.
Okay, but you emphasized internal. What about the external view, how the organization interacts with the outside world?
That's where it was a bit different. For the external context, 2 tenets weren't found to be visibly present.
Which ones?
One was about how external systems or agents help compensate for performance variations within the organization. The other was about organizational learning and growth coming from external sources, like learning from successes and failures elsewhere.
But were they completely absent?
No, importantly, the study did find that these 2 tenets were implied in a few sections, just not explicitly stated in the context of external interactions.
So, generally speaking, the standard seems more focused on applying these principles inside the organization.
That seems to be the pattern, yes. The tenets were generally identified more often within the internal context than the external one.
Which tenets popped up most often internally?
The ones related to multi-directional and non-linear interactions and information flow, that's tenet number 1, basically about communication and influence going many ways, not just top-down.
Okay.
And multi-system functional dependencies, tenet 2, recognizing that different parts and people rely on each other. Those 2 were most frequently visibly present internally.
And which was least common internally?
That was tenet number 6, compensation for performance variability, how the system adapts and adjusts. It had the fewest direct links inside the standard. And even looking at visible plus implied links, interactions, tenet 1 was still top, and variability, tenet 6 was still bottom internally.
Interesting. Now flip to the external context. What stood out there?
Well, interactions and information flow, tenet 1, was also the most frequently linked tenet externally, both visibly and implied. It seems the standard does recognize the need for external communication.
What about the others externally?
Tenets 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7, covering dependencies, constraints, capability, emergence, and shared responsibility. They were all visibly linked externally, but only to a few sections each. Kind of a similar low frequency.
And those 2 that weren't visible externally, variability and external learning.
Right. Tenets 6 and 8, they were only found to be implied externally in just 3 sections for variability and only 1 section for external learning.
So learning from outside seems particularly underrepresented.
Based on this analysis, yes. There was also a point about interpretation, wasn't there? Regarding risk and opportunity.
Yeah, how did they connect that to successes and failures for the learning tenet? No, wait.
Well, because the standard talks a lot about identifying risks and opportunities, but doesn't explicitly use success and failure much in the context of learning. So the researchers interpreted managing risks as basically learning from potential failures and exploiting opportunities as learning from potential successes. It was a way to map the standard's language onto their tenet about learning from both.
Okay, that makes sense. Did the analysis reveal any specific aspects of the tenets that ISO 4501 maybe doesn't cover well, even implicitly?
Yes, a few things stood out. That nonlinearity part of interactions, the idea that cause and effect isn't always simple or proportional.
Like a small change having a huge unexpected impact.
Exactly. That aspect wasn't really found visibly or implied, which is interesting because the whole Plan-Do Check Act cycle the standard uses kind of hints at nonlinear improvement, doesn't it? Iteration, feedback loops.
Yeah, you'd think so. What else?
Well, shared responsibility, tenet 7 was addressed. But the standard didn't seem to get into the effects of indirect interactions, how actions in one area might ripple out unexpectedly and affect safety elsewhere.
The unintended consequences.
Right. And finally, while the standard acknowledges performance varies, it didn't seem to fully capture the idea of unexpected emergent behaviors or necessary trade-offs that naturally arise in complex systems when people adapt.
Okay, so let's move into the discussion. Pulling these results together, what's the bigger picture here? What does this all mean for organizations using ISO 4501?
Well, the core takeaway is that implementing the standard could genuinely help organizations manage safety more systemically, moving beyond just fixing individual problems.
How so?
The fact that multi-directional interactions, Tenet 1 was found so often, suggests the standard really values communication flow up, down, across levels involving stakeholders. That's foundational for a systems approach, right? Empowering people, enabling learning.
And externally, who are those interactions with?
Externally, it's talking about interactions with, regulators, auditors, contractors, suppliers, other bodies. The standard also clearly recognizes functional dependencies, Tenet 2, how different parts of the safety system rely on each other.
Like pieces of a puzzle?
Sort of. Think about the inputs and outputs between OHSMS components, or how the whole PDCA cycle connects. It really highlights that things like leadership commitment and worker participation aren't optional extras. The system depends on them.
And you mentioned the PDCA cycle plan, do, check, act. That seems key.
It really is. That cycle itself embodies shared responsibility. Tenet 7, which, as we saw, popped up in many parts of the standard. It implies everyone has a role in designing, running, and improving the system.
But there were gaps, particularly looking externally.
Yes, that limited recognition of external agents as sources for learning, Tenet 8, or support for managing variability, Tenet 6. It does suggest a somewhat inward-looking perspective in the standard.
Like the outside world is mostly seen as a source of rules or constraints, rather than a source of solutions or learning.
That seems to be the implication, yeah.
Yeah.
External parties are things to be managed perhaps more than partners in improvement.
And what about that missing piece, the explicit mention of nonlinearity? Why might a standard shy away from that?
Well, the researchers speculate it might be because nonlinearity implies less predictability, accidents that seem to come out of nowhere, or small failures cascading unexpectedly.
Which might feel uncomfortable for a standard aiming for defined processes and outcomes.
Possibly. Industry often wants certainty from standards, but ignoring nonlinearity means potentially missing how complex systems actually behave and fail. So for listeners, it means needing to look beyond the standard's linear framework sometimes.
Good point. The study also found a balance between constraints, Tenet 3, and capability, Tenet 4. What's the significance there?
It suggests ISO 45008 tries to balance acknowledging the external pressures rules, market demands, with the need for the organization to build its own internal capacity, its resources and skills to manage safety effectively within those pressures.
Okay. And that point about compensation for performance variability, Tenet 6, mostly showing up in the performance evaluation part of the standard.
Right. That suggests the standard tackles variability mainly through formal checks, audits, reviews, metrics, which are important, of course.
What?
But it might overlook all the informal, local adjustments people make constantly to keep things running safely. The workarounds, the tweaks, the undiscussed adaptations.
The stuff that doesn't make it into the official reports but is crucial for day-to-day safety.
Exactly. And those local adaptations are often rich sources of learning about how the system really works and where the pressures are. If they're not captured or shared, the organization misses out on that learning, linking back to Tenet 8.
Like the frontline workers knowing the real way to do something safely, but it's not in the procedure manual.
Precisely. The standard's focus on formal evaluation might not fully tap into that crucial practical knowledge.
Now, every study has limitations. What did the researchers acknowledge here?
They were upfront about it. It's qualitative research, so researcher interpretation plays a role, even with methods like Delphi to ensure consistency.
Subjectivity is always a factor.
Right. And their framework of 8 tenets came from a specific, though credible, set of literature.
Using different sources or defining the tenets slightly differently might have yielded slightly different results.
Fair enough. Did they suggest where research could go next?
Yes, a few interesting avenues. Like, how clear is the standards language? Does implementing it actually change how organizations think about safety in practice? And importantly, how can audits be designed to better assess and encourage this kind of systems thinking rather than just checking compliance boxes?
Really practical questions for making this work better. Okay, so let's wrap this up. Bringing our deep dive to a close, what are the main conclusions we should take away?
I think the main message is cautiously optimistic. The analysis suggests ISO 45001 does have the potential to nudge organizations towards a broader socio-technical systems view of safety by highlighting interactions, dependencies, responsibilities, internal and external factors.
Exactly. It lays some important groundwork.
But it's not perfect from a pure systems thinking perspective.
Correct. The study clearly identifies gaps. That limited, explicit focus on nonlinearity, on those unexpected emergent outcomes, on valuing the local, everyday adaptations, and especially on learning from external sources.
So the standard is helpful, provides structure, but maybe emphasizes the internal workings and sees the external world more as a set of boundaries to manage.
That's a good summary. It promotes a systematic approach, which is good, but perhaps one that could be seen as a bit inflexible, not fully capturing the dynamic, sometimes messy reality of complex systems.
Which leaves us with a final thought for our listeners, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay, so considering everything we've discussed, the potential of ISO 45001, but also its limitations from a systems perspective, here's something to chew on. How can your organization actively go beyond just meeting the standards requirements? How can you deliberately build in a deeper appreciation for nonlinearity, actively seek out learning from outside your own walls, and truly value and learn from those local, practical adaptations your people make every day? Moving beyond compliance to build truly resilient safety, what would that look like in your context? Something to think about.